What is a gambit in chess? A gambit is a chess opening where a player gives away one or two pawns just to gain an advantage in the beginning. Here are some different types of gambits. First, the King's Gambit. Pawn to e4, pawn to e5. Pawn to f4, pawn capture f4 accepting the gambit. Bishop to c4, queen to h4 check. King to f1, bishop c5 threatening mate on f2. So pawn to d4 attacking the bishop, so bishop to b6. Knight f3, queen h6. Pawn to g3, queen h3 check. King f2, pawn capture g3 check. Pawn capture g3 attacking the queen, queen g4. Bishop capture f7 check, king capture f7. And then knight e5 check winning the queen. Next is the Vienna Gambit. Pawn to e4, pawn to e5. Knight c3, knight f6. Pawn to f4, pawn capture f4. Pawn to e5, knight back to g8. Knight f3, pawn d6. Queen e2, queen e7. Knight d5 attacking the queen, queen e7. Knight capture c7, queen capture c7. Pawn capture d6 check, discovered check, bishop e7, and then we capture the queen. Next is the Danish Gambit. Pawn e4, pawn e5. Pawn d4, pawn capture d4. Pawn c3, pawn capture c3. Bishop c4, pawn capture b2. Bishop capture b2, knight f6. Knight c3, bishop b4. Knight e2, knight capture e4. Castle, knight capture c3. Knight capture c3, castle. Knight d5, bishop c5. Knight f6 check, pawn capture f6. Queen g4 check, king h8. Queen h4, bishop e7. Bishop d3, game over. Up next is the Evans Gambit. Pawn e4, pawn e5. Knight f3, knight c6. Bishop c4, bishop c5. b4, bishop capture b4. c3, bishop a5. Pawn d4, pawn capture d4. Castle, pawn capture c3. Queen to b3, queen e7. Knight capture c3, knight f6. Knight d5, knight capture d5. Pawn capture d5, knight e5. Knight capture e5, queen capture e5. Bishop b2, queen g5. Pawn h4, queen capture h4. Bishop capture g7, rook g8. Rook f to e1 check, king d8. Queen g3, queen capture g3. Bishop f6 checkmate. Up next is the Halloween Gambit. Pawn e4, pawn e5. Knight f3, knight c6. Knight c3, knight f6. Knight capture e5, knight capture e5. Pawn d4, knight g6. Pawn e5, knight g8. Pawn h4, pawn h5. Bishop c4, bishop b4. Bishop g5, bishop e7. Queen f3, pawn f6. Queen d5, pawn d6. Queen f7 check, king d7. Pawn e6 check, king c6. Pawn d5 check, king b6. Knight a4 check, king a5. Bishop d2 check, king capture a4. Pawn a3, pawn a5. Pawn b3 checkmate. Next is the England Gambit. Pawn d4, pawn e5. Pawn capture e5, knight c6. Knight f3, queen e7. Bishop f4, queen b4 check. Bishop d2, queen capture b2. Bishop c3, bishop b4. Queen d2, bishop capture c3. Queen capture c3, queen c1 checkmate.